I'm Tom Clark, I'm the editor of Prospect Magazine, and I'm delighted to be joined this morning by the brand new Aviation Minister, Robert Corbs, as well as Claire Walker, who's from the British Chamber of Commerce, and John Holland-Kaye, who's Chief Executive of Heathrow. I think there will be time later on for anyone listening who wants to chuck in questions, which I'll be able to keep an eye on in the chat and the Q&A. You see them down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So do chuck things in there and I'll endeavour to get round to them as the discussion goes on. But without further ado, I would like to start, and I'm very keen to hear from the new minister and also from Claire from the Voice of Business. But John, we've called this Flightpath to Recovery, which is a good optimistic title because it's good to be optimistic, but I think we need to start by being fairly blunt about what's just gone on in aviation these last few months. It's quite a long way from recovery just yet, isn't it?
Well, yes, you're right, Tom. And let me just give a bit of perspective on that. And first of all, we shouldn't underestimate how aviation is the lifeblood of the UK's economy. We only get to be the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world because we are exporting goods and services all around the planet. And so aviation really is vital to what we do. And a lot of that is going a long way away. And what Heathrow does as the UK's only hub airport is to pool demand from across the UK and Europe to support long haul flights, which are normally very hard to make economic. And we have normally flights to 85 long haul destinations. And that's important not just for passengers, and you can imagine how many people in our services sector travel internationally. It's also important for exports. 40% of the UK's exports travel in the belly hold of passenger planes. So if you think about how the world has gone online, we've become more and more dependent on aviation for anything that's high value, needed just in time, or with a short shelf life. And just from Heathrow alone, we carry 40% of all the UK's exports. That's an incredible proportion. But since March, of course, international travel has dried up completely as countries have closed their borders, down to only 3% of their volumes last year in April and May. And we really only remain open to support British nationals coming home and bringing in freighters to support PPE for the NHS. There really were very few international flights at that time. And it was only when the government moved to the risk-based approach and relaxed quarantine for low-risk countries that we started to see some recovery, but even then only back to 20% of normal volumes in July. And a lot of that, of course, was outbound UK tourists trying to get some summer sun. But then more countries have closed down than opened up as we've gone into a second wave. And airports really are not viable at this kind of level of business. And all of our revenue comes from passengers. So as passenger numbers have fallen, our revenues have collapsed. But our costs remain high. Airports are really capital intensive infrastructure assets. We are in a safety critical and high security environment. So even when we have nobody flying, we still need to maintain all the airfield lights and the air bridges. We need to keep the borders, the boundaries of the airport safe. And so there's a limit to how much we can cut our costs. We have been able, by cutting capital spend and dividends, executive pay, renegotiating contracts, we've got our cash burn. So the amount of money we are losing, if you like, down from 250 million to 150 million pounds a month. And these are eye-watering sums of money. We've come down to just 2 terminal operations. We've cut our management team by a third. And now we're facing further hard choices as we come into the second wave between cutting frontline roles or permanently cutting pay. And I think that around a third of these 75,000 jobs at Heathrow have either already gone or are at risk, as are the millions in sectors that rely on us. And when we're cutting capacity here, that's cutting capacity your biggest port. That's the equivalent of cutting capacity on your motorways or your rail network. You can't get the economy restarted until we get our biggest port back up to full capacity. And we don't need bailouts to do this. Our investors have taken the pain of our losses in the month so far. We do need to get people flying again. And that's about getting COVID-free passengers from markets like the United States, who are our biggest trading partner, to be able to travel again. And testing will be the answer to make sure that people who are coming into this country don't bring the disease with them. And that will allow us to get on to what we really need to do to help to rebuild our economy, create this truly global Britain, levelling up and building back better.
Thank you very much, John. Robert, I'm going to bring you in. I mean, some of those figures there were absolutely startling. We heard about passenger volumes in April and May being at 3%, what they would have normally been. So that's 97% down. And we know the job losses that John talked about at Heathrow, but also in lots of the airlines, really huge cutbacks. There you were, as I believe a parliamentary private secretary, given this baby to hold in a very dangerous condition in a matter of about a month ago. How did that feel?
Well, thank you. Firstly, can I just say it's an absolute honour to be here to speak on behalf of the government and, of course, as the new aviation minister today. And thanks, John, for everything that you've laid out this morning. Well, Tom, you're absolutely right. It has been an enormous challenge. It's certainly something it is in any event to suddenly become a minister, certainly when you're in the midst of the scale of the challenge that we all have at the moment. That's doubly so. However, I'm very lucky in that it's a sector I'm enormously interested in. It's something that I'm passionate about. I am getting absolutely stuck in making sure that I speak to all sectors. So John and I have already had a meeting already in the first few weeks, all the airlines, airports, and of course the maritime part of my brief well. And that has meant that I'm getting out and making sure that I'm hearing exactly what everybody has to say. And so that's the real thing that I can offer, is that new, very keen, very interested and very willing ear. And then, of course, I can take those points back to other colleagues in government. So yes, it's a challenge. It's also an enormous honour, and it's an honour because Britain's always been an aviation nation. There's absolutely no two ways about it. We are leaders in terms of aviation. We have been throughout history. We still are now in terms of technology, in terms of the way we approach aerospace, in terms of the way that we approach safety, for example. All of these things are things that Britain is a leader in, and that is absolutely central to what the government wants to achieve. And I absolutely will be working hard to ensure that Britain remains the case. Obviously, massive challenge for the sector. There clearly is. We have suffered all over the whole of the economy. A major slowdown across all sectors, and aviation is no different. What I absolutely can see is, whilst I totally recognise the challenge that's there, I will be working very hard, as will all my colleagues across government, not just the Transport Department, but across the whole of government, to work with people like John to ensure that we can get aviation back up and running as soon as it's safely possible.
Thank you very much for that, Minister. Claire, I'd like to bring you in now, because obviously aviation doesn't exist in any kind of vacuum. It exists in a wider business context. And one thing that a lot of people are wondering, and one thing that would be absolutely crucial for the longer term chances of aviation, are whether some of the habits that have been reset during this extraordinary few months that we've lived through, and look at all of us now having our party conference on Zoom rather than in person, how far do you think some of these habits are going to stick once we've all discovered the joys of video conferencing? Because that could be quite serious for aviation, couldn't it?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invite. On that particular question, I think that there will be, perhaps not a return to how it was fully, but much of the income that we will see that will go into the airport and the aviation sector will come from freight, will come from passengers, will come from people going on their holiday and doing leisure travel. Some of that is business travel, and we will see some resurgence in that. But they will come from other areas, and those are what will drive forward a recovery. So I think if you think of it just in terms of business, it's a very narrow focus, although a very important focus. And I think the thing that I would say is that we've heard really, articulately from John as to the challenge that, his business and his airport is facing. But actually there's two sort of other aspects that I just wanted to flag. The first one is that, very much this is a localized issue. You know, many local airports are experiencing the same issues that John is experiencing, and they are sources of employment, they are sources of great pride to the community, and they also connect us to markets, and they are struggling with these same issues all across the country, and they're a real risk of some of those not surviving, and actually meaning that our regions and nations are not as connected going forward. And the second thing I wanted to say was, you know, freight is a real challenge for many of our businesses. You know, in order for us to trade in a global economy going forward, we need to be able to have those routes across the world. And we were in a place where we were, you know, really trying to move forward with some of those quick global links. And as this pandemic, you know, goes on, those are the things that are really at risk. And given that we are, you know, leaving the transition period very shortly, those are the things that businesses are worried about. You know, actually, how am I going to get my goods across the world? How am I going to transport them effectively and on time? So there's some real challenges here which go further than just, you know, business travel, although that is a real worry.
John, do you want to pick up on that point about freight? Because of course the whole thing, the different bits of the flying operation, they're mutually dependent, aren't they? The viability of the thing bringing the freight in is going to depend on how many passengers you've got up above the freight, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, without those passenger planes going, we have far fewer planes carrying freight around the world because it's the same plane. And Claire makes a really good point about how this is about the whole of the UK. And if I just give you an example, we normally have 3 flights a day to Tokyo. And that's more than any other airport in Europe has. So it's a real advantage for us. And if you were to look at what was going on that plane to Tokyo, you'd find it's carrying fresh Scottish salmon that's got from the farm in the north of Scotland and is going to get on the table in Tokyo within 24 hours. That's something you can do when you've got 3 flights a day and guarantee that supply chain. And that supports thousands of jobs in Scotland, of course. But it's also carrying executives from the Japanese motor companies who have put their bases in the Thames Valley and their manufacturing centres up in the northeast, and will be connecting people down from Newcastle through Heathrow, getting back to Tokyo within 24 hours. And it'll also carry students who are a vital part of funding our university sector, and of course returning tourists. You know, Japan is a fantastic source of tourism income. And on that same plane, we're covering the entire gamut of inward investment, tourism, students, and exports. And you can't just cut off one aspect of that and think that the whole system is still viable. We need all of those to be working to allow the plane to be viable. But equally, we need that plane to allow the rest of the economy to be successful.
Interestingly, we've just had one of our first questions pop up from David Stevens, picking up really on Claire and John, what you've just been talking about. And I wonder if John or Robert would like to pick up on this, which is COVID has demonstrated the vital right that air freight plays, but it's exposed the problem of over-reliance on belly freight. In a post-Brexit world, what contribution is going to need to be made by dedicated freighters? Either of you got anything to say on that?
Well, I think there's a role for both.
Yes, should I go first?
Sorry, Robert, you go ahead, please.
No, it's okay, John. You've sorry, the lag on the audio. You started speaking.
Well, there's clearly a role for both. And if you are aggregating large volumes of goods to go to a particular market, then dedicated freight is a fantastic way to do that. But if you are trying to get just-in-time deliveries of small quantities, high-value goods to remote markets, then you rely on belly freight. And the reason for that is that the passenger planes are going to places like Tokyo 3 times a day, Mexico City twice a day. We're not going to be able to have dedicated freighters going to some of those markets every single day of the week. And if you're a small exporter somewhere in the Midlands and you want to get your goods to market, someone's buying off the internet, you want to get their goods to them in 24 hours, it is only a passenger plane that will get you there reliably every day of the week. And that's why in a just-in-time world, belly freight is so critical. And it's a real asset that we have in the UK, that we've got an airport like Heathrow with these 85 long-haul destinations, because it means it's easier for UK exporters to get their goods to market than it would be for someone in Italy or Belgium or Scandinavia that don't have one of the world's great hubs on their doorstep.
Robert, do you want to come in now?
Thanks. Yes, well, John's right, of course. It very much, you need both parts of the transportation capability because they essentially cater to different aspects of things. Naturally, when there are fewer passenger planes flying around, as we've seen, you would see a shift to dedicated cargo carriers. But it very much depends on what it is you're seeking to do. So there will always be a role for the dedicated cargo carriers. But in particular with regards to, as John said, small just-in-time items, but also perishable items. Those are ones that are like, so it's the smoked salmon, for example, that John referred to earlier, those sorts of things, or mozzarella coming from Italy, perhaps, those kinds of things. That'll always have a role for that smaller freight carrying capacity, which really is going to be belly holds. So, we're absolutely aware of that. One of the reasons, of course, why, the whole thing is interlinked, Tom, as you've said, there's a number of moving parts in this, and it's a reason why we need to start getting the aviation sector back up and running in a safe fashion, all parts of it.
Let's have a word now on Brexit, because it's, I'm sure, the big theme apart from COVID at this conference, but also because it's so imminent now that Brexit gets real. I think there's two halves to this, putting it bluntly. There's an opportunity half that we can come on to about more international trading, but there's also, I imagine, or is there, the same kind of issue that people worry a good deal about at the seaports. How far or not, John, have you got to be on kind of emergency standby for the situation in December the 31st, which after all is not very far away now?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't really know yet what the impact is going to be, because we don't know whether there will be a formal trade deal with the EU. So we have to plan for a range of different outcomes, but it may well be that more goods are going by air in the early months of next year as trading links settle down, and we'll work closely with the government on that. But we also want to try to ensure that for passengers coming through the border, that's as smooth a journey as possible, and we don't overcomplicate what is already quite a challenging point of the passenger's journey. We ought to be making it as welcoming as possible for people who have a right to come into this country to come here, whether they're from the EU or elsewhere. But I think the third point I make about Brexit is that we have now stepped out of the EU family, and we're carving an independent future for ourselves. And in that independent future, we need to control our own trading links. And it's the trade routes from our airports that are our international trading links. And if we become dependent upon flying through Paris or Frankfurt to get to global markets, then we'll have given up the independence that we've just achieved. And that's why actually having a strong hub airport in the UK at Heathrow, which has as good connections into India and China as we have into the US, those will be the three great trading centres for the 21st century. That is vital to the long-term independence and trading success of the UK. And that's what we need to work hard to do in the next few years.
Claire, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, just a small point, which is around business preparation. So, whatever the outcome of the negotiations, and we all hope that there is a deal, there will be increased paperwork. We know that will be the case. And I think one of the things that we're deeply concerned about is that businesses who are trying to trade internationally haven't, managed to procure or engage with the, particularly smaller businesses, with the level of increased paperwork that will come at the end of the transition period. And it's really important that they do that, but also that they work within customs brokers or custom freighters to be able to transport goods. Otherwise, you will see some real backlogs potentially at borders and potentially at airports. And it's one of the things that was the founding principles of Chambers of Commerce 165 years ago, was to help with trade, and it's something that we continue to do in this space. So if you have got a business out there, do start looking at what you need to do to transport in a different area to the EU, which you haven't needed to do before.
Yeah, interesting. And how worried are you about this, Robert? Because obviously we've already got a disaster that's kind of come from nowhere in the form of COVID. And are you worried that there's going to be problems on December the 31st? Or are you confident?
So we are working really hard with all our partners, people like Heathrow, of course, but also across the departments that are business facing, to ensure that all of the steps that are taken are being taken. Also people like the CAA to make sure that any steps that have to be taken are minimised, simplified as much as possible. We don't know what the outcome of negotiations will be yet. Those are ongoing, but we are absolutely taking those steps. One thing I would like to say is just to echo what Claire's just said about businesses, just checking that they are ready. The government has a major campaign running, which is called Check, Change, Go, and you may well have seen advertisements for that in newspapers, online, and on motorway billboards, for example. So if you are out there and you are running a business, please do look at what steps you may need to take, because there will be a change, and then you can reach out and get some help if you need it.
And just one little kind of comeback in the purpose of getting a little bit of a debate going with the government on this, and a little bit more debate into the fringe. One of the things that's really difficult for businesses is that not all those answers are there yet, and we have done some work around where there is still questions to be answered, and particularly across the piece on some of the things needed for the transition period. And someone reminded me from our North East Chamber last week, actually, that the reason we argued so hard as business communities for a transition period is to give businesses the time to prepare. And the one thing that we haven't done yet again is giving businesses the time to prepare. So my plea is to make sure that so many of those questions are answered. Otherwise, you're setting up businesses who are already on their knees as a really, difficult place for them to actually fail in the first couple of months.
Well, thank you for that point. So that'll certainly be taken back. And yes, as I say, I can assure you that there are many meetings going on across government with affected businesses. Obviously, negotiations are ongoing, and we'll do all we can to help.
And John, just on passengers more specifically, is there going to be problems in terms of just the infrastructure, the way the passports work and all of that at Heathrow, or is that element of the jigsaw now kind of in place and we know how it's going to work and it's going to be okay?
We don't have the final decision on that yet, but there's no reason why there should be any difficulty. And I think one thing the government did very well in the last 18 months or so was to widen the eligibility to use the electronic gates at airports and other ports to countries other than the European Union countries. So if you're coming from the US or Canada, Japan, you can use the e-gates just as you can coming from France. And I think that is actually a world-leading border experience. It's been made a little bit harder because of COVID and the need for Border Force to check people's paperwork. But I think once we get beyond that, actually Britain can have a world-class experience at the border and make sure that for those people who have a legitimate right to be here, they can come into this country and get a really warm British welcome.
I'm just going to bring in a question here from Sean Taylor that's squarely directed at you, Robert. It says, it was great to see you today, but the question from me is whether you're working heavily with Henry Smith regarding the future of aviation as the Gatwick MP, because there's clearly concern the southern UK will become an economic wasteland with the end of furlough looming. I imagine he means particularly around the, the penumbra of the of Gatwick Airport.
Thank you. Yes, well, of course, Henry is an absolutely key stake, a very, very strong champion for Gatwick, I can absolutely assure you. So, yes, the department's been working closely with all MPs who are affected, and Henry, of course, is chief amongst them. So, yes, I can assure you that's all happening.
And then, John, this might be an out-of-date question, I'm not sure, but it's quite funny, so I'm going to pass it to you from Rachel Smeeth, which is, where did we get to with Boris and the bulldozers? Is he still flat out against expanding Heathrow?
Well, I don't think that the question has come up recently. We've been more focused on other issues such as dealing with COVID. But to go back to the point I made earlier, the government has got a very clear vision for global Britain, and that is one of the real prizes from Brexit, being this strong independent trading nation. And you cannot do that unless you have a bigger Heathrow. If we do not expand Heathrow, then this independent trading nation will be depending upon Frankfurt and Paris to get to global markets, because they have invested in capacity where we have not done so. So this is critical to the economic security of the UK, that we get on and expand Heathrow. And while that seems an odd thing to be talking about at a time when demand is down so much, this is exactly the time we should be putting the investment in, so that when the economy does recover, we've got the capacity there to be able to take advantage of it. And of course, in doing so, you get the benefit of the tens of thousands of jobs that are created by these big privately funded infrastructure investments.
Thank you for that. And I can see Claire nodding as well there. Minister, like, it is a long way off. We are dealing with kind of a collapse in demand rather than the question of managing expanding demand. But looking further ahead, could you just remind us, because so much has happened since this was last in the news, where the government is up to with expanding or not expanding airports longer term?
So I'm afraid this is one of those cases where I have to give the explanation that because this is before the Supreme Court, because I'm a minister, it's not something I'm able to discuss. So I do apologise to the panel for not being able to give a comment on that. But that's where we are with this.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got about halfway through the session without talking about the other emergency, which some people think is the biggest emergency of all, which is climate change, and how on earth we build a sustainable recovery rather than just a recovery that's going to hit some kind of ecological brick wall. I don't know who wants to start on this. Claire, I mean, do you feel optimistic that in the first instance recovery, and then in the longer term potentially growth of aviation will ultimately be able to be squared with Britain hitting the climate targets, which are quite ambitious and now shared across the parties to some extent at least?
So I think this talks a lot to COVID actually, and to one of my concerns around the impact of this pandemic in supporting net zero. So, you know, one of the things that you will see from the lack of aviation, the fact that many, you know, flights have to stop because of quarantine, because of this pandemic, is that supply chains are being really impacted. And these are supply chains that not only work with the businesses and the airports and provide them with services when they're operating, but they're also supply chains that are working on innovations in the future. And so one of my great concerns, and I've heard this from a number of chambers, particularly in areas where they have got skills, that we're working towards this net zero ambition, which is something that I know that Heathrow very much support, and as you rightly say is cross-party, is that the knock-on effect of not having of airports and aviation fighting for survival and trying to maintain our position in the global world, and not having the support for some of these businesses, is that the investment will not be there for those businesses that are looking for solutions in the longer term. And I think that's something that we cannot lose sight of, that actually, you know, many of these supply chains are trying to think about innovations and have real skills as well. Some areas have specialist skills that cannot be found or cannot be replaced anywhere else, and those businesses may go to the wall because of something that was completely unplanned and has no impact on the longer term future of whether aviation will happen or whether net zero aviation is a good thing, because these are all things that we know to be true. So that's my concern, is that the knock-on effect of this pandemic will be that those businesses that are looking at solutions will just go under.
John, do you want to say a word or two about what's going on in the sector? I mean, there's the immediate issue of offset, and be useful to explain to the audience how that works, if it works, and how it goes, and then the bolder technological stuff that could hopefully happen in the years ahead.
Well, I am optimistic actually on decarbonising aviation, and actually it's something that the UK really is taking the lead on. And it was only back in February that the entire UK aviation sector committed to net zero by 2050. And that might seem a pretty obvious thing to do, but actually aviation has been excluded from any climate deal historically. So the fact that the UK is the first in the world to step up is really significant. And since then, we have been building a coalition of the willing internationally to do the same. We've now got most of all the airports in Europe and many around the world signed up as well. British Airways has achieved the same with their network, with airlines now in China and the US and Russia in the Middle East signing up to net zero by 2050. So we really are building a coalition of the willing to change things. Now we need to turn that into action. And I think this is where the government can take a real lead, both in terms of putting the policies in place, but also helping to shift the investment towards the solution. And the solution for aviation is sustainable aviation fuels. Because if you want to decarbonize flight, you either change the planes or you change the way in which they're powered. And to change the planes will take way beyond 2050 to change the entire global fleet. But you can change the fuel well before then. And this opens the opportunity for an entirely new industrial sector in which the UK can take a global lead. So it actually plays into the levelling up agenda that many of the places that could be the new centres for production of sustainable fuels are in the northeast and the northwest, in Scotland and the Wales, areas that are badly in need of regeneration investment. And the fact that we now have people like British Petroleum, along with specialists such as Velasys, wanting to invest in this kind of technology, shows that the industry really is changing. But we need some government help with this. We need them to set a mandate for the proportion of sustainable fuels that will be used in aviation. And we need that to be a global standard, so that the EU is setting a similar kind of mandate. And this is where the government's leadership of COP26 could be a real milestone in decarbonising global aviation. Because if we can present a solution to a big global issue in November next year, we can help to bring international support for that solution, then we really can get a global consensus within the next 12 months of net zero globally for aviation. And that would be a massive achievement for this country.
Thank you very much. Minister, we heard something quite rare there. We heard a spokesman from an industry calling for not less red tape, but more and much firmer regulation there in terms of what is acceptable to put into an aeroplane if you want it to fly. What do you make of John's idea about mandating a change in the fuel mix?
I'll come to that in a second, if I may. What I'd just like to start off by saying is that, yes, there are challenges here, but of course it's a challenge to go net zero anyway by 2050, but there are also tremendous opportunities here. And I'm also very optimistic about not only where we are in terms of sustainable aviation, but in terms of the opportunities that there are for operators and for manufacturers alike, and the UK is already leading on this. You only have to look at the Jet Zero Council, for example, which brings together industry and operators, and Heathrow, for example, sit on that, and that's intended to see a transatlantic airliner fly across on a sustainable basis within a generation. Now, there's a long way to go. This is challenging. I'm not making two bones about that. That's absolutely right. But look at the progress we've made already. So, for example, in my first week or so, first 10 days, I went up to Cranfield University, where I saw the first flight of a hydrogen electric powered passenger aircraft. Now that's a 6-seater Piper Malibu at the moment, but ZeroAvia, who are taking that forward, the company that are running it with government support, they're looking to have a much longer flight, getting into the hundreds of miles from the Orkneys before the end of the year. We've seen Airbus already. They've said that they're looking to develop a sustainable airliner as well. You're already seeing industry and all parts of the sector with government help coming together and making this a reality. There's a long way to go, absolutely, but we are already in a very good place. But the other panelists are absolutely right about the types of aircraft that you fly. There's many moving pieces in this as well. You've got to think about things like how we get people to airports, You've got to think about the ground handling aspect of it. You've got to think about the way that aircraft are operated. So airspace modernisation is a part of this as well. And you've also got to look at the types of aircraft that are flying, which, as I've said, we're already doing. So some of those are longer term things, which are UK's in a really good place on. We really are leading internationally at this very moment. And things like sustainable aviation fuels are something that's in a more of a medium term goal. The government's working upon all of those things. It's a multifaceted thing. We'll have to look in due course about what steps we take in terms of regulation and so forth. But what I can say is this is already being taken forward on a cross-industry, cross-sector, cross-government basis.
And what do you think about the specific idea of having mandating something about the fuel mix as something on the agenda for the COP talks, which of course the UK will be in the chair for?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. We'll have to go away and look at that. I don't think I should make a commitment on that now in terms of what future regulation we'll be doing. But as I say, sustainable aviation fuels as a concept are very much on the agenda. We'll be looking at those. We'll have to look in due course what steps will be appropriate.
So we've got questions pouring in now. There's stuff from Holland-Kaye, who's referencing several of the same things the minister's just been talking about in terms of, looking beyond even the change in the fuel mix to electric, hybrid, hydrogen aircraft and what Airbus has been doing, but also pressing the question, Claire or John, whoever wants to have a go at this, of what level of investment is actually going into any of these exciting kind of longer term potential like innovations, and what level of investment is needed. In other words, is there a gap in terms of what we are putting into these really blue skies ideas and what we should be putting in?
Probably better for John to answer this one than me.
If I can make a start with that, it's a really good question, because I think there's a global agreement coming together around the kind of package of measures that Robert's talked about, and for long haul, sustainable aviation fuels are the only solution that can decarbonise by 2050. And the majority of emissions from aircraft are on long haul flying. So unless we have a solution to that, we don't have a solution to decarbonise aviation. And the good thing is that sustainable aviation fuels exist. It's known technology, either using biofuels from second generation waste, or by synthesizing a mix of hydrogen and capture carbon, which again is a technology that exists. The issue is that we are way subscale to be able to decarbonize global aviation. And the change that has to happen within the next decade if we are going to make a difference. And this is going to cost hundreds of billions of pounds of investment to get there. This is a massive revolution in energy. Now, we shouldn't be scared by that, because we have got big oil companies like BP, who are the usual investors of hundreds of billions of pounds in this kind of technology, getting behind it, and they themselves are committed to decarbonize by 2050. But the speed with which we go really depends on the speed at which that investment goes in. Because the good thing about sustainable aviation fuels are that they're drop-in technology. You can blend them with kerosene. So the faster you scale up production, the faster you can decarbonize the sector. And of course, if you've got a country at one end of the route that provides sustainable fuels and the country at the other end doesn't, it doesn't matter. You can still use the same plane, which isn't the case with electric flight. So there's lots of advantages to it. But we have to get the production up. And this is where the mandate is actually a really powerful tool, because if BP or Velocis know that by 2030, 10% of all global demand has to be from sustainable fuels, they know that they can invest with confidence. If they don't have a clear demand signal like that, then they're going to be much more cautious about the speed at which they ramp up. And that might mean that we don't get there quickly enough. So the mandate is a really important policy tool for solving this chicken and egg problem of getting the supply side to the level where it can meet the kind of demand that we need.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got Kate Hewitt, who's weighed in and said that she's pleased and thinks it's appropriate that we're talking about decarbonisation, but wants to press us, particularly John says, but I'm going to bring in Claire just because we haven't heard from her for a bit, on whether or not there should be a formal inclusion of aviation emissions in the UK's carbon budget under the Climate Change Act. Because what Kate's wondering is if actually we're still short of a level playing field at the moment, with emissions from other sectors counting, but aviation not fully counting. What do you make of that, Claire?
Well, there's been some good reasons as to why this has been the case. I mean, I think one of the things that has impressed me so much is the commitment from aviation and broader industries towards tackling climate change. And so I think it's more around, our view would be it's more around, are we seeing the investment, which we've talked about, but are we also seeing the will and the leadership in this space? And I think you are seeing those ambitions, and I think you are seeing those leadership. And I think, using a blunt instrument is not always necessarily the best way of driving the impact that you want. As I said, I am concerned around not the ambition or the skills, but how many of those will be sustained going forward. But I'm ambivalent around whether or not you use acts or not. I just think it's have you got the outcome that you need? And this is a really exciting space. And there's some chat on the with people talking about whether or not they feel that the climate will be something that will take away passenger numbers. I think there is a possibility that we could all travel in a very net zero way, which opens up our world if we get this piece of operation right. And that's why the prize is so high, and why the ambition should be really high. But I'm ambivalent on the method.
Okay, Minister, unless you want to comment on that, there's another question here for you. Would you like to say something on that?
I'm happy to, just a quick comment on that, actually, if I might, Tom, which is just to make the point that, of course, this isn't just a UK issue. This is very much an international issue. I'd just like to point to the work of ICAO, which is the international body on this, and the UK's very much leading role within this. There's a scheme called Corsia, which is essentially a carbon's offsetting scheme, which is something that we've very much been a part of. That's something that's growing. It's obviously only it's a short-term measure, but it does just show that action is being taken on an international level as well. And the government is very much funding the research and development, which will go forward to the long-term solution.
Okay, slightly swerving subjects, just because I'm trying to bring in as many people from the audience as we can. Andy Smith is asking us whether the UK is going to trust other nations' testing regimes to allow pre-tested negative travellers quarantine-free process when they arrive. Now, I imagine that you don't get like many hotter potatoes than this kind of thing right at the moment. Robert, first, would you like to say a word on where you think the government is on the quarantining regime?
Yeah. So firstly, I'd just like to point out that the government's absolutely clear about the level of the challenge that the industry has, and about the industry's views on tests. It's obviously a major issue. It's something that's raised a great deal. Really led on a number of the issues that have already helped. So the corridors policy itself and the expansion of that to include islands was an area in which the UK led. So although obviously we all want to go further as soon as it's safe to do so, let's just remember quite how well the UK has done already and how we are leading in an area where other nations aren't. So the government is obviously looking at what role testing may be able to play. It's not the silver bullet that some portray it as, particularly with regards to asymptomatic cases, but we will be working with Public Health England, with airlines, with airports, and with people all across government to see what role testing might have in the future. That work's ongoing now.
Okay, thanks for that. John, how have you been finding adjusting to the quarantine regime? It must be like nothing you've ever seen before, because we're in times we've never seen the like of before.
Well, you have to be very fluid, and I think Minister is absolutely right that the UK has taken the lead in taking this risk-based approach, and we have seen other countries follow that lead. But the roulette that passengers play between arriving in a country which is green and then finding it turns red in the middle of their journey and having to come back and quarantine, that really makes it very hard for international travel to get going again. And we need a better way to allow people from high-risk countries to travel. And we need to remember that the vast, vast majority of people in what we would consider to be a high-risk country don't have COVID. Actually, the UK is a good example of that. We would be considered a high-risk country at the moment, but the vast majority of people in this country do not have COVID. So the question is, how can you make sure that only the people without COVID are traveling from high-risk countries? And that's where testing comes in. And if I can take a slight issue with the Minister's comments, testing is a silver bullet. A single test may not be, and the industry is not arguing for a single test. The industry is arguing for a reduction in quarantine if people test negative, and if people test negative for COVID after a period of time, then they should be allowed to come out of quarantine early. And that won't get aviation back to a normal level that we've been used to, but it will make it easier for people to travel, and increasingly make it easier for people visiting friends and relatives and for business travelers to get back to some kind of normal. That's exactly the same standard of certainty that we apply in other parts of the economy. That's exactly what the kind of tests we use for people in the health service. So there's no reason why we shouldn't apply it for international travellers as well.
Okay, and in fact, we've got Luke here weighing in to all panelists saying, if Germany can have an efficient testing system, I gently suggest we use their system. We're not, in fact, world beating at everything, and Germany have a very strong system. I don't know, Claire, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, at 100%. I mean, the issues that aviation are facing around testing are the issues that the whole business sector is facing around testing. And I do think that we have put a high bar on one type of test, which is the current test that you get through NHS, without thinking how rapid tests can be part of the sifting process or the triage process. And we sort of put the best being the enemy of the good. So for example, with the rapid tests, which, you know, so far is not the gold standard, they only produce a false positive. So if you've got a positive from there, then you could potentially get a NHS test, and that would be a way of reducing demand on that overall system. But these are the types of things that are going to open up aviation. These are the types of things that are going to open up business. And at the moment, we've been raising these issues for months and getting nowhere. And I am getting very frustrated that actually businesses will actually be the ones that will suffer. And only through thinking slightly differently will we see see an open economy which is safe for people to use, and we'll be able to drive through growth, because we're going to be living with this virus for some time. And as we've heard from John, you know, many businesses and airports are all hemorrhaging cash. So we need to think about what we can do safely within the framework that we've got to take a different approach to testing, and a different approach to tracing as well.
Minister, it's not principally your field responsibility for this overarching issue of testing, but of course, in many respects across the economy, it's the only question that counts at the moment. So I wonder if there's anything general you'd like to say in reply to what Claire said there.
There's a couple of things, thanks Tom. So there's a couple of things I'd like to say. I'd like just actually to address this Germany point straight off, please, if I may, because it's often raised. And we've just got to look at what the situation there actually is, because what a lot of people think is the case with Germany actually isn't. Now, Germany is stepping away from the testing on arrival point. Germany is now having new arrivals self-isolate for 14 days, with a period of testing at least 5 days after arrival. So Germany is stepping back and stepping away from that testing on arrival point, which many people hold up as being the straightforward answer. The same is true for other countries, like Iceland, for example, who have also had a similar regime in place. So look, we just need to, the thing isn't straightforward. It's quite complicated. And what we are doing across government is looking to see what role testing can play. So as we've already laid out, the difficulty with testing on arrival is that the difficulty in picking up people who are asymptomatic. That's a major, major problem. And SAGE suggests that the vast majority of people just aren't picked up if they're asymptomatic. But testing later on is much more promising, and that's what we're looking at there. So we've got to be very careful when we're talking about testing as to which aspect of testing we're talking about. Are you talking about testing on arrival? Are you talking about testing after some days? What kind of testing you're talking about? So more generally, across government, from PHE to DFT, all of those questions are being looked at the moment. That work is ongoing right now.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
We completely agree. We have to put health first, and if the science is telling us there needs to be a gap between to allow the disease to incubate, then that's what we need to do. So just to be clear, the industry is not calling for a single test on arrival. The industry is calling for testing after a period of quarantine. But testing on arrival is not the perfect answer. A better answer will be that people test before they leave the country that they're departing from. And that avoids the need to, if you imagine a British business person going to visit their subsidiaries in the United States, it will be better for them to be able to quarantine and test at home in the UK rather than sitting in some hotel in New York when they arrive. And that will make it a much better experience for them. And that, of course, means that you've got to have some international standards for testing that are agreed. And I think this is, again, where the UK government can take a lead in establishing that common international standard, starting with the United States, who are our biggest single trading partner. If we can get a London-New York pilot up and running, that could become the template, which could be used by other countries for pre-departure testing. And that really could start to open the global economy up again. But and I think this is a brilliant example, as we had with decarbonisation, where an independent UK can really take a global lead.
Okay, thanks for that. Just keeping going with the questions because they're still rolling in. We've got one from Rachel about internal travel. I guess this goes back more to the climate side of things rather than the COVID side of things. But like it says, with all the investment going into HS2 and with the ongoing issue about emissions, isn't it time to think that the future is more about international travel and not to get so hung up on national and domestic flights? I guess this is a reference to things like the bailing out of Flybe earlier in the year. How much of a role or not do all of you see for domestic internal passenger travel in the months ahead? Claire, you first of all.
So it's really important. It's a critical part of the jigsaw. As we talked about, you know, the example of the salmon going from Scotland through to Tokyo. But if you imagine that you haven't got those domestic internal hubs, or either in terms of other transport routes, so rail or road, as well as aviation, then you can't have that global trading environment, and you also can't be the type of business that you want to be if you can't move around. So it's vitally important. It's vitally important for the reasons we talked about in terms of trade. It's vitally in terms of leisure, and it's really, really important in terms of that levelling up agenda. And what we saw, and it was really difficult, all 53 chambers came together in the middle of the pandemic in March when it was really starting, saying you have to support local and regional airports because they are so critical to local communities for all the reasons that we talked about. So, you know, yes, you can't have one without the other, and they all come together in an overall jigsaw.
Okay. How many have we got, Claire, and how many do you think are threatened? I don't mean tiny little airfields. I mean, you know, proper regional airports.
Well, I think it's a balance, isn't it? Because there are some areas where, you know, it's really important to have actually quite a strong regional hub. And then there are some areas, that need to have a level of connectivity, but because of traffic or transport, it's never going to be, or population, it's never going to be so high. But it's really, it's really important to get the balance right. And we need to make sure that every part of the United Kingdom is connected. And one of the things that you see when you introduce a new trade route or new flight route, whether that's, from Inverness through to Heathrow and then Heathrow to somewhere else, is that you see a real impact on that local community trading somewhere, so whether it be South Korea or whether it be Tokyo or so when that route comes up, you see an economic benefit from that area. And that's something that I think if you look at it into sort of siloed way, you don't actually see the full benefit. So I think it's a mix, and it has to be that the whole of the UK is connected in a way that's effective. And at the moment, some areas are really connected and some areas are not.
Minister, back in, I think, 2008 or 2009, when David Cameron first threw the Conservative Party behind HS2, he explicitly linked it to holding back on airport expansion and kind of implying there was a trade-off, if you like, between these two things, which I think is what Rachel was picking up on in the question there. I mean, do you accept that at all now, that there's if you're going to have more rail capacity, you might need less domestic flight capacity, or do you think we shouldn't be thinking of these things as a trade-off?
I think we just have to look at the situation that exists at the time. Obviously, we're many years on from that now. I think we've got to make sure that, I think ultimately it's going to have a multimodal approach, because it'll very much depend upon what kind of travel you need and to go where. You'll often take the travel option that you need depending on where you're coming from and where you need to go. So rail clearly has a huge part in that, absolutely. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the real importance, that critical importance for regional connectivity as well. I'm thinking about the different parts of the Union, places that are slightly more remote. Making sure they're well connected as well is critical.
Okay, and John, where are you on regional flights? I mean, I'm sure you think they're important, but things did look quite dicey earlier this year, didn't they?
No, they are critical, and I was on a call with the Inverness Chamber of Commerce a few weeks ago, and it's extraordinary how much their economy depends upon connections through Heathrow to global markets. They really get it. And I think the answer has to be that if we can connect by rail to airports and give people a choice of doing that, then we should do so. And in our own backyard, Western and Southern Rail are obvious things the government should get behind and make happen. But if you're in Aberdeen or Inverness or Belfast, you're never going to have a rail connection as an alternative to an internal flight. And there, we actually should be guaranteeing in perpetuity that there will be a good level of service between those cities and the UK's hub airports, so that businesses that want to invest in Inverness can do so with confidence that they will never be cut off, because that's exactly what happened to them 20 years ago, and they really struggled. And there's a thriving pharmaceutical sector there. There's obviously fishing, tourism, and a university there as well. And they really suffer if they don't have that guaranteed access to global markets that comes with a direct route to Heathrow. So if I could have some more policy recommendations, guarantee access in perpetuity for markets like that, but also make sure that we can have the onward connections to long-haul markets, definitely the US, definitely China, definitely India, because that is where our future trading will be. That is what will make us global Britain.
Thank you very much. We're virtually at the end of the hour now, but I think we've done pretty well in covering off Brexit and sustainability, and then the immediate question, the economic recovery and testing. So it's left to me now simply to say thank you very much to a very lively audience there, coming up with the questions and keeping our panellists on their toes. Thanks also to John for joining us from Heathrow, and to Heathrow for getting behind the event as well, to Claire for speaking up for business from the British Chamber of Commerce, and then especially to the Minister, Robert Courts, for joining us as he gets his head around this role a few weeks in an extraordinary time. But thanks all very much for taking part, and special thanks to all of our panellists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.